Okay, hey. So my name's Joshua Kolden, and I'm the architect of the C4 Cinema Content Creation Cloud framework, which we're working on at ETC. Now, I say I'm the architect of it, but really the whole point of C4 is to create architectures of production. So actually, in this context, all of you are the architects. We're trying to architect making movies in a better way. So C4 offers some specific ways in doing that. And what I'm going to talk about today is kind of an overview of how C4 can facilitate workflows and address the issues that are going to start hitting us as we start moving things into the cloud. It has values to us even before then, but there's some specific issues that we will find when we start moving things to the cloud that C4 addresses. So part of this is identifying what I mean by domains and how we talk about domains. There's two different ways that I often refer to in domains. One is domains meaning physical locations like servers or the cloud or a laptop or a studio or a production. But then also there's domains of knowledge, so like the director or the digital imaging technician on set, or cinematographer, or any person that's working in a production workflow. So we'll talk about each of those, and if I slip up and talk about domain and that's unclear, then I'll try and clarify that with some questions and answers afterwards. The next part is the asset ID system that allows us to uniquely identify assets as they move through any kind of C4 designed workflow. You can use the asset ID system by itself. It's useful in differentiating assets in different locations and always being able to refer to the same asset. And then the workflow language that connects all of these pieces together so that you can talk in terms of what different domains are responsible for. You might have a compute domain which needs to do processing like transcoding on an asset, and then you would have a workflow that maybe says move this information into this domain and then do this process on it and then move it to some other domain. So I'll try not to get too technical. This is really just an overview, but we'll see how far we can go with it. So what I have here is what you might start with when you conceptualize a workflow on set. You have a director with a star on his t-shirt, and you have a camera and a DP or on-set personnel of any kind. So we need to be able to work with the photography that we generate. The most simple version of this might even just be with one person, where you have a person and their camera and they're shooting their family. Okay, so all the jobs are wrapped up into that one person. But as you get into larger and larger productions, you start segmenting out the different job responsibilities, and those become communication transitions where one person has to communicate with another person who's now doing that job. So if we take this one step further, it quickly actually becomes kind of complicated. The camera is producing actual raw data that in our file-based workflows that we've been working with now for a few years will also potentially contain metadata. So the blue icon there is the metadata kind of tag along. It might be part of the file format itself, or it might be a sidecar file. The raw data, the actual camera original imagery. And then you might have people on set that are generating metadata. They might be doing camera reports or other kinds of things like that. That might hopefully is digital, as we've been talking about, but there's still people doing that on paper. And then we have maybe a process of some kind that has to happen. So this raw data gets piped into some kind of big machine that does something. It might spin out, small compressed movie files that have been compressed into into H.264 movie files, and you might get ProRes file for editorial. You might get a sequence of DPXs for visual effects or something. And then, of course, the director is going to produce metadata in the form of notes on shots and other kinds of information like that. So then we mix in actual facilities where this information might move to another location. So the DPXs might go to the VFX house, the ProRes file might go to editorial. Right now, the way that this workflow works is you take these files and each of these entities kind of manage them themselves. You might have the director putting some files on their hard drive and naming them whatever they want, and you might have the camera assistant or DP or whoever labeling files as they come off of the camera in a certain way. You might have transcoders that have either automatic naming conventions or naming conventions that you've created for them. Then you're putting this all into different places, so you might be putting it into a visual effects facility, editorial, etc. So when I was talking about domains earlier, these are the domains that I was talking about. So you might consider the domain of the director, the director's laptop. The domain of the camera and the DP, that might be the set, on set. You might then have a domain that's transcoder, which might be a transcoder that's on set as a device, or it might be a cloud service, or it might be at a post facility or intermediate facility. Then the visual effects facility is a domain. The editorial facility might be a domain. Then any one of these pieces might be backed by a cloud service of some kind. That may be known in advance, or it may not be. And then how is this data actually moving between all of these locations is a little bit up in the air, because sometimes the data is so large that you're moving them by big blocks of hard drives as opposed to, say, over the wire. Sometimes it might be an Aspera connection that's ultra secure and relatively fast, but sometimes the kind of unlimited bandwidth of a big box of hard drives is hard to avoid. So the main thing here is you've got all of these different domains, and they're all kind of, at the moment, coordinating on their own. So if anybody calls anybody else, they're really talking in terms of either they've agreed in advance on some kind of standard way to refer to the files they're talking about, which is usually a naming convention. So they say, oh, I'm talking about shot 23 from the other day. That's a star take, and the director said, whatever, make it bluer. So the more organized and professional production, the better those kinds of notes will be kept and tracked. But it's still a very manual process. And as you start scaling this infrastructure out, where you have cloud and you have hundreds of different facilities and thousands of different people touching these files, it becomes quickly untenable. So the answer to that is the asset ID system, a universal asset ID for every single piece of media of any kind of, basically, if we're talking about file-based workflows, then we're talking about an ID on every single possible type of file. So right now, what those different IDs include, oh, perfect, thank you. That's what I need. Thanks. So right now, a file that's named something in a file system, in this case, MOV 38923.r3d in the incoming folder, if you took a completely different file and put it in that location, then it would replace it, right? Whatever was there before would be gone, and whatever you've put there to replace it would be there now. So a file system name isn't a unique identifier. You could easily make a whole bunch of different files live in the same location on that path. The other problem is that the file system itself has typically been used to also impart a lot of organizational and metadata information, such as the show, the shot, other kinds of things that different organizations might put in the file naming convention to indicate what the file is. And that's how you're expected to find the file. But all of that requires a priori knowledge about how the naming convention is going to work and what its purpose is. Plus, you really want something that's a little different. What you want is you might want to look at things more in like a database format, where you say, okay, well, I want all the shots, all the footage that came from a certain day, all the shots that contain a certain actor, all the shots that have a star print take on them, all the shots that are in a certain format, etc. So the metadata is really how you want to access the file. But when you have a file system, you're restricted to accessing the file in a very structured and literal way. It is in this exact path. And if I know all that information, but I don't know the order that the information should be put in to find that path, or I don't know the naming convention of the particular facility, then I don't know the path to the file. And then, of course, there's room for lots of human error. Somebody doesn't put something in the right place or what have you. So what we want is a universal ID so that when one organization, say editorial, wants to know or talk about a particular asset over in VFX, that you're ensured to be talking about the same exact file, including down to the version of the file. So what we do is we create a SHA-512 hash, which is a cryptographic process that all operating systems include the tools to do this. So it's built in, it's very accessible. If you're familiar with where the work we've been doing, we've been saying SHA-256 for a while now, but we've finally changed it to a SHA-512 because it processes faster on 64-bit hardware, despite it being twice as big, or several orders of magnitude bigger. So the SHA-512 is a cryptographic hash, which means that it's a relatively short number. It's a 512-bit number. It's a 64-byte number, which creates a string like the string under my asset here on the right. It would be even longer than that. So that string is the unique asset identifier for any asset. Everybody on the planet will compute that ID exactly the same way. If you're on set, you'll compute it the same way as maybe 10 years later somebody in archive would compute it, right? It doesn't matter in time or space. It doesn't matter if you agree on it in advance or not. It will always compute to the same thing. So that creates this permanent cubbyhole by which this particular asset can be referred. So we can associate database tables to it. We can put it into object storage and refer to it using this ID. And if editorial calls VFX and says, hey, I want to talk about H1F HR8, then you're talking about exactly the same file. You're talking about literally the same file, including the version number and anything else. Because if you're to change even one bit of that file, it would generate a completely different asset ID. Which means it's also useful for referring to doing checks on the data. So if you've moved it from one location to another and you want to confirm that you actually transferred the data successfully, you can use the ID system to confirm that you have the actual file. And the flip side is also true. You may already have a whole bunch of assets and you can actually confirm in advance before transferring them that you don't need to transfer them because you already have them. It contributes to a process that's called data deduplication. So if you have a huge amount of data storage, you'll be able to look at the IDs of any of your assets in any data storage and be able to say authoritatively that you have exact copies of files in different locations. So you can decide if you want to keep those as for archival purposes or if you want to recover storage and keep only a smaller number, one or a smaller number of those assets. So part of the language, I'm going to flip this diagram around. We talk about taking the file, running a SHA-512 on it, and computing the hash on it. So talking in terms of the C4 domain language itself, we actually think the other way around. In the language, we say, well, I want a result. I want to talk about my assets. What is my asset? To be able to uniquely identify my asset, what do I have to have? I have to have the SHA-256 of it. So on the left is the result I want. I want to be talking about my asset. So the reason that we go in this direction is we can talk in terms of dependencies. So we can say, okay, well, editorial needs to have the assets from the shoot, and the assets from the shoot need to be aren't valid until they've been converted and so forth. So you can create this dependency graph of things that you need. So in this case, my asset needs the SHA-512. That's all it needs, the SHA-512 and the path to the file that it needs to get the SHA-512 from. So if we have so this is a literal line of C4 script. It's this simple. If you, it actually should say my asset. Anyway, so imagine on the left where it says asset colon, it says my asset. So we are assigning that variable, if you will, that result, my asset, the ID of file slash, incoming movie R3D. So now, anywhere where I refer to my asset, or in this case, since I didn't type it out correctly, asset, anywhere else I refer to asset, it contains the ID of that asset. So now I could create a dependency against that, and I could say, well, I have this result. I want to run a composite with that asset or a color correction with that asset, right? So now I can say, where here I've said asset colon file, I could also do another format, which is to do a carriage return in tab. So here it's the same thing, where we have result would be asset, and dependency 1 might be the path to the actual asset. So this allows us to create a nested tree of different dependencies. And the way that the language works is basically exactly like I've outlined here. So it becomes extremely human readable because we don't have semicolons and commas, and we don't have XML, start and end tags. We just can say the result that I want, indent, here's what it depends on, indent, here's something that dependency depends on, and on down the tree. And when you put all of that into one file, then you could have another file that depends on that file, right? So that you can create this kind of spider web of dependencies across an entire system. So in this case, we could say that editorial depends on the transcode result, which depends on the transcoding of the ProRes original asset from camera, which depends on delivery from set, right? So when you have that list of requirements in that order, when you synchronize that requirement, maybe that's a requirement that editorial had. So they want to, all they really know is that they want to have the actual transcoded result. So they might say, well, I need an H.264, well, a ProRes. I might need a ProRes file for take 27. So they would specify here the result that they want is the ProRes version of the take. And that what they need, what they need is the, ProRes transcode of the original asset. But they don't know how to do those things. They just know what they need. So now over on maybe if I go to the transcode group, they know how to take an input, which is maybe the R3D file, and transcode it to a ProRes file. That's all they know how to do. They don't know how to use the ProRes file. They don't know how to necessarily do much with how to generate an R3D file. But they can describe as a dependency of their system, well, to produce a ProRes file, I need an R3D file. Editorial needs a ProRes file, so I can satisfy that dependency. So now we can describe this entire graph in terms of these domains. So if you look in the editorial domain, that person, whoever is the technical person creating their workflow and writing that out into a C4 workflow, they can say things like in terms of what they need and what they will deliver. I'll deliver a final edit. I will produce EDL and actual viewable movie file of the edit. To do that, I need notes from the director, and I need ProRes files from onset. So once they've defined those requirements in that file can get pushed to anybody upstream of them that needs to push data to them. So now the editorial, the compressing, the transcoding group or engine can look at those sets of requirements and kind of pull from its upstream. So it says, okay, well, now that I see that editorial needs this particular file, to generate that particular file, I look upstream and say, okay, where is my raw file? Now I'll process the raw file to deliver to the editorial. So it keeps walking back upstream, and each domain only needs to know how to do what's within their domain, both in terms of their physical location and in terms of their knowledge. So for example, you could create, under the C4 system, you could create a scripting language, you could create a script that would say, okay, every time that we get a take that's been color corrected and ready for the director to review and give notes on, then I want to push out an email. And then every time the director replies on a web form or with an email to an automated service, we're going to package those notes in and deliver those to editorial, because editorial always wants to know what the director's notes are. But in each case, the knowledge domain is only what that particular group is expert in. So the director only needs to know, or the technical assistant that's helping the director by creating these C4 files will say, okay, well, I'm going to pull footage for me to review, and I'm going to push notes. I don't know how the notes are used. I don't know where the footage comes from. I only know that I need footage coming in, and I'm going to produce notes coming out. That's what that particular node of this network does. So that can work in each location, and because we're talking about fixed assets that can be identified uniquely across the entire universe, we can create a chain of evidence, as it were, a dependency graph that can represent everybody across all these different domains, but each individual domain only needs to define what it takes as an input and what it delivers as an output. They don't need to know any other parts of the chain. If they do, great, but they don't have to know it. So you can take advantage of people's existing leverage. We're not handing a process down to anyone. We're not saying, well, you have to work this way that we've decided is a better way for editors to work. No, you can work exactly the way the editor you've always worked. The only difference is you're going to say explicitly, this is what I expect to receive, and this is what I will deliver once I've done my work on it. So that's the general principles of how we're separating and conceptualizing the different domains, and how we're using the asset IDs, and where this workflow language is kind of the direction it's headed in. So if there's any questions. Yes. Mike's.
There you go. So in a lot of these processes, especially shot extraction for VFX, for conform and marketing, there's always going to be, in the case of sequences, sequence trimming, and in the case of movies, extractions as well.
Right.
So what happens there? New asset IDs are generated on those new trim sequences.
So
and is there a sort of a history that is generated and always?
Right. So the workflow language itself is not to use too big of a word, but it's immutable, meaning that once you've defined a workflow, it exists and it was in that state at some point in time in the past. And if you make any changes to it, that's effectively a completely new thing. So in the case where you have, say, for publicity, you're pulling cut extracts from existing footage. Well, then that unit would say, well, this is the input I need. I need inputs that are this different cut of the commercial cut of the thing, as opposed to the production cut of the movie.
But you don't have an asset ID representing that extraction yet at that point. That's a placeholder.
You do. I'll show you. Hold on one second.
The asset doesn't exist at that stage.
No, but the request exists, right? So maybe you have a commercial EDL. But yes, if you're saying, okay, so you might end up with an EDL that says cut from, frame whatever to frame whatever on this particular shot. That hasn't actually been cut yet. So, right, you don't know what the asset...
hash it, you have nothing to hash.
Right, you don't know what the asset ID is yet. But that's where that's the differentiation between using the ID and using the domain language. Because the domain language says, to satisfy my results, which is the commercial edit, I need this EDL to be processed through this, system that will extract the cut. So to deliver me the ID of the asset that's the result, well, the second you write that into the file, no, it doesn't know what any of these assets are. And if you look here, I haven't specified any asset IDs in anticipation, right? I don't know what subdependencies asset ID is.
But somewhere in there, you'd have a regex that would represent the result of the SHA-512 hash on
the idea is that as you this language,
generated.
there would be some system behind it,
Yeah.
like say the editorial software or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And it says, okay, well, subdependency is the cut length, right? The EDL for that thing. So go run this process for me, chew on it, and then shoot me all the results, which are the asset IDs.
Which part of that is the object ID. The asset ID.
Yeah.
So just to go back to your other slide where you had the asset ID, no, this one here. So wouldn't the SHA be part of the ID here? So
you mean that path right there?
the path, yeah, wouldn't
No.
instead of MOV 389, wouldn't be that a SHA ID here, a hash?
So what this is saying, because the language says if you're going to put a URL that's to an asset like this, then actually what we're talking about, what asset equal, what the word asset equals is rebooting. Oh, I probably might have ran out of juice. Sorry about that. So asset in that context, what asset equals is the SHA, is the hash.
Okay.
So when you and the way that you do that is you specify it through URLs. So if it's a URL that goes to a file // then it's somewhere it can find locally, but it could be a remote URL as well.
Okay, and the SHA is calculated, I'm assuming, only once when you generate the content.
That's going to end up being kind of application dependent, but the idea is that it's really doesn't want to do that. Okay, so basically what's after asset, if it's a URL, then it's representing an asset. And if the URL is file, then it's assuming it's local, but it could be anywhere because you could use the whole regular URL system to find it. You could, of course, separately retain as metadata the path. So you could say, well, this originally was at such and such a path. You can retain any additional metadata you'd like to retain just as strings of data. But
yeah, calculating SHA is usually very expensive. It takes a long time, so that's why I'm asking if this is retained or is it done?
It's relatively inexpensive. Somewhere in here. Okay. Yes, it is a cost. It is. I would not agree that it's a heavy cost. It's actually a pretty fast process, and a lot of cryptographic hashes are computed automatically on the fly as files are moving around. So what I was saying is it's implementation independent on maybe the file transfer thing. Maybe, for example, as Aspera starts to support C4, they compute the SHA automatically as they transfer the file just for data integrity purposes. But by the way, hey, here's the ID for the asset at the same time. So you can use it once and have it useful in many places.
I understand fully the interest of the SHA, but somewhere we are losing something which is a semantic. Somewhere when the people are creating something like that, there is some semantic. And so do you make some solution which allows an operator? Operators are very bad at handling SHAs. Who is checking the MD5 of a file manually? You know, there's no way.
Nobody's going to do that. Yeah.
So is there something, have you planned to do something which allows to an operator to bring two operators to use semantics information, that means human readable information, and keep the consistency? Meaning that, for instance, if I call that move one name, operator one, and the other one uses the same names, that we are quite sure that they are speaking over the same, or if they're not speaking, that we highlight them, something.
So the way that that's handled right now is exactly here, where I've called assets a variable name and I've called it asset. So that was my choice. I could have called it anything. So the idea with these files is that if I were to create a C4 file that refers to, say, a list of files in my system, then I were to take that same file and distribute it to everyone that's in my organization, then they would have the same value for asset as I have, because the information that gets distributed is that asset name and then the hash that goes associated with it. So now person B says, I'm talking about asset, and person A says, I'm talking about asset, and you know you're both talking about the same asset.
Yes.
Right. Exactly.
But
Yes.
But don't you have a problem then of namespace collision, which is typical when we are doing programming, you know, namespace? Because
Right.
you may call that asset in another script, somebody may call it asset also.
Yes.
And you have a problem
Right.
with namespace then.
Yes, and that would. But the nice thing about that, or I don't know if it's nice or not, but the way it's been designed is that collision would be alert. You would be alerted of that collision immediately, right? There would be a namespace collision. You'd say, okay, well, asset from person A is this ID, and asset from person B is this completely different ID. But there's two ways that that's resolved. One is if they're exactly in the same, like there's somebody that's using your laptop and you both did the same exact thing, but different assets, then you would get basically what would look like a compiler error. It would just tell you that there's a collision, and you can solve that collision because what you could do is you could say, well, okay, Fred's asset is actually my asset too, or vice versa, right? You could rename it into your own naming system if you wanted to, right? So now you could say, well, my naming convention, editorial's naming convention is a dependency of my naming convention. So I will rename things as they come in, for example, if you wanted to. So VFX people do this already, right? So what they'll do is they'll create a shot from editorial. Editorial will say, okay, this is whatever shot it is, but then visual effects will say, no, we want to call it SC01 or SC10 so that we can put some, a 9 in there if we wanted, count backwards if the edit changes. But that is less resilient, right? But they're still doing it. So what we're saying is, okay, you can keep naming it that way. But the difference is what the mapping is from editorials, take whatever, we're going to rename it SCO, 010. And so now, kind of as you've moved up this tree, never mind we're referring to files anymore, we're just referring to different names now, right? So the visual effects company would say, well, everything that comes in, we're going to rename it to our internal naming things. So there's two things that have changed there. One is a name, but also the domain, because now we're in the visual effects facility. So another component to this, which I didn't illustrate in code, is the domain. So whenever you're inside of a single file or you've declared the domain at the top of the file, then your naming space is inside of that domain. So in that case, I couldn't refer to asset anymore from editorial if I was in visual effects. I would have to go to /editorial/ asset, and then make my new internal asset equal that, right? So it's a little bit like, if you know anything about naming namespaces for programming, it's a little bit like that. You have to kind of put the library that you're referring to in front of the actual namespace and kind of name it all the way out.
Just a quick one. I'm curious to find out why you didn't rely on some of the standardized naming ID conventions like UMID or IDER or something like that and leverage those versus creating, unfortunately,
Right.
yet another one.
Yeah. So the problem with those is what if you have an asset and you've given it a UUID, which is a common way to identify files. Then somebody else pulls that file in at some other domain. Visual Effects pulls the file in, editorial pulls the file in. But nobody on set created the UUID. So it gets to editorial, and editorial puts a UUID on it. Now Visual Effects also puts a UUID on it. Effectively, for those two organizations, those are different things now. They have two different IDs because two different domains, not knowing what the other one was doing, created an ID for them, right? So now you don't get any of the benefits of being able to talk about the same thing anymore. You can transmit all of your IDs to the other organization so that you know what you're talking about and map them in some way. But then you have this human level of like, well, which one maps to which one? And you don't know. There's no way to really do that until you start imposing processes on people and saying, okay, well now you're going to have this assigned ID, and the process for syncing those assigned IDs is whatever it is, so that you agree that you're going to call them the same thing. Whereas this system says, this is the asset, it's always this asset ID. If I never talk to any of the participants in this entire organization or any organization, or 50 years from now in archive when they're pulling this up to do the, director's amazing ultra edition, they don't have to talk to me about what it was. The asset ID is the asset ID forever and ever.
Yeah, I think there's provisions in UMID to avoid the UUID type scenario that you described, and I think that we're involved a lot with long-term preservation and archiving and things like that. And I think if you have one, although not ideal, but a bit flip in an entire DPX package of 500,000 files doesn't render that entire asset useless, but it renders it now unidentifiable.
A different asset, yeah. It meaningfully does render it a different asset, but you could. There's no reason you can't throw away an asset, right? So, for example, if you're just doing versions on top of versions, and the normal way you work is to save on top of the file, like I don't care about intermediate versions, I just want the result. That's fine. It'll have technically it has valid IDs. Maybe you computed them and maybe you didn't, but you can toss them, right? You don't have to retain any of the data itself. You would just say, okay, well, version 1 was ID whatever, and version 2 was ID whatever, and version 3 was ID whatever. But if I go to any file system and look for version 1 and 2's IDs in an object store, they don't exist, right? And that's fine. You're not. You can toss it, right? It's in that sense, it's ephemeral. You don't need to retain the ID if you're not interested in the ID.
Another point to that is that Don Delacino is on we have a breakout team within the framework, and that team, the CTO of IDER is involved in paying attention. So we are not at all ignoring them.
And also, the system doesn't preclude the ability to use any ID system you'd like to use, right? And those almost become just like metadata or variable names or however you'd like to use it. So just because this one exists doesn't preclude the use of another one or a different hashing system either.
A question about your workflow. So in your illustration of results and dependencies, maybe I'm not familiar with that representation, but when we implement on distribution systems workflows, we think in terms of the workflow and then discrete tasks within that. And so these dependencies, I'm assuming, would be the equivalent of discrete tasks. And I guess my question is there going to be an effort to create a library of tasks? Because there's some certain standard, you talk about different domains, sort of consistent or common activities or common things that are generally done. And I know you don't want to ever get to the world where it's production in a box and it's just sort of defined. Choose production workflow A and it handles the whole movie. But is there going to be some intended effort to build a library of tasks, or I guess in this case dependencies?
There conceivably could be. We haven't gotten that far in terms of actually contemplating a group that would be putting that kind of thing together. We're hoping it's kind of a natural process in which people who are experts in their respective domains get some familiarity with C4 and say, okay, well, I'm going to push my workflow into this system and I'm going to publish that workflow, or I'm going to just send it to the people I work with or whatever. And then that could be a document that's generalized in a way that you could just use, from production to production as a workflow.
Or like a studio might have their general templates for certain aspects, and then the director or producer might come in and put theirs on in their own area of expertise.
And the nice thing is once you have one of these in place, it can represent one of two things. It can represent the abstract workflow. This is how it would work in general, but I haven't filled in any of the blanks, if you will. But it can also represent a concrete workflow, which is this asset depends on this asset, depends on this asset, all the way down the chain until you have produced a final movie, theoretically. So what's nice about that is you can then choose to cache that information at anywhere in that tree, right? So you can say, well, I can just keep the whole workflow and only keep the original master files because I can rerun the entire workflow, headless, if you will, on a server later and produce the results again. And I'll know that I've produced the results successfully again because I can check the IDs, and the IDs will be the same.
Also, part of this effort is right now we've released 1.0 of this, and now we're going around to some of the software vendors to get them to document their APIs if they don't already have it, so that we can properly ingest them into the system and grab metadata in a somewhat pass-forward consistency. Over the summer, we'll be working on what's called Luna Part 2, basically, which is a short film implementing this framework, and it should be sponsored by both Disney and Universal. And so we'll be doing a short film actually using these tools. And we already did one before without the actual framework in place, but some of these key concepts, including the Universal Asset Identifier. And we have written a white paper that's about 40 pages on the topic. But it's not released to the general public yet. It's still Universal property because they paid for the original study and research. So,
all right. If there's no more questions, thanks.
All right.